It may have started with the Odyssey 2000 in the US, but here in Canada, it started with something a little bit more classy, and a little later. That was the Atari 2600. And that is what started the console wars in Canada. For a long while, the Atari was the popular gaming console in Canada. Many others would come and go, such as the 3DO, the Sega CD, and all the others. But I'm going to talk about that later. Hello again. I'm going to be talking about the console wars, the way I observed it when I was a kid. I used to live in a very small, remote town. Even a drive into the city was a pretty big thing back when I was a kid. We still had access to the same stuff as some of the other city kids and some of the other kids. However, it was a lot harder to get it because of the location. One thing that I do remember is that with the console wars here in Atlantic Canada, it was mostly between Sega and Nintendo. Sure, the Atari 2600 made it into the Atlantic provinces, but the other consoles such as the 2600, the 7800, the Lynx, the Jaguar CD, 3DO, the CDI, all those other ones did not really make it into the Canadian market. For an example, I can talk about the NES all day, but I know nothing about the Sega Master System. Why? Because the NES came out here in Canada, but the Master System did not. Sure, it could have came out in places like Toronto, Ottawa, or even Regina, but here in Nova Scotia, we just got stuck with the NES. Sure, we also got the Genesis, but that was a steaming lump of shit altogether. You might be asking me why I hate the Genesis. I really don't. I think it was superior to the NES and superior to the Super Nintendo, both hardware-wise and game-wise. However, very few games actually use true 16-bit graphics. And as far as I'm concerned, I was always a big RPG fan. But a lot of the RPG games that did come out for the Sega Genesis were very uninspiring and unmotivational. And very boring. I mean, sure, 16-bit, wow, whatever, but then again too, Sega didn't have endorsements like Nintendo did. In fact, the one thing that would have kept Sega going is if Sega had Final Fantasy on its systems. Honestly, you can say whatever you want, but you've got to admit, when Final Fantasy 1 came out for the Nintendo, everybody had to have a Nintendo to play Final Fantasy 1. It was just that crazy. In fact, there were people, debating over which was better, Final Fantasy or Phantasy Star. And a lot of the times, these were debates between hardcore Nintendo fans on one side, and then hardcore Sega fans on the other. And neither one would back down to the other. I mean, it was so bad, there was a reason why most game stores near where I lived at the time did not cater to the fans. For an example, I can remember one time going to the video store to rent a Super Nintendo game, and then seeing outside a fist fight between a Nintendo fan and a Sega fan. And that was the saddest point of the console wars that I can remember. Because by that time, I was thinking, man, if this is what these consoles and video games are doing to us, we can't even get along because we have our own likes and dislikes. Sure, you can say a whole lot of things about what kept Nintendo afloat, but the biggest factor was Final Fantasy. especially the first 6 games. For example, when the first one came out, it boosted Nintendo sales, mainly because it was that good in the time. I mean, many people still compliment Final Fantasy VI, even though it's been many years since it's been made. And I mean, what really put PlayStation on the map was the fact that Final Fantasy VII was one of the first games put out on it. It really affected the sales of the console. But I'm not going to get into too much detail about that. I'm still going to talk about the wars. Now, Sega did have its own library of RPG games. However, it's far outclassed by those done by Nintendo. And I mean, Nintendo had more companies that will do the games for them, such as Taito and even Natsume and Squaresoft. But Sega only had its own company and sister companies. While it can make games, they often had very few endorsing games from other companies. Oftentimes they would get a contract from Capcom because they release their games across all systems. But for Sega's specific games, it was usually one of their sister companies, which often led to problems when it came to release. Now, the one big downfall of the Genesis when it first came out was that it had very few peripherals. Well, then Sega started to put peripherals on it. For example, the Sega CD. But then the 32X came out, and then more and more and more and more. And soon it started to cause errors and everything else with the Genesis games. So pretty soon they abandoned the Genesis, went straight to Sega Saturn, and soon went to the Dreamcast. With all this rushed effort to stay on top, Nintendo took advantage of this and slowly and surely released the N64. Sony was also releasing a game console as well, and they also took advantage of the whole hype between Sega's new system. With something like that as your Genesis, eventually people started to realize that this was getting ridiculous, and pretty soon they started buying into Nintendo more and more. Sega was in a downfall at this time, and they finally decided after the Dreamcast bombed out that they were not going to make another console. Instead, they sold off all of their consoles and actually bowed down and said to Nintendo that they were going to allow Nintendo to make the next Sonic games. But why did Sega fall in the end? It was mostly due to the fact that although Sega put out some very decent hardware, the games that they had available were just uninspired and unimaginative. I mean, let's face it, when Sonic came out on the Sega CD, it was the same thing as the Genesis versions. Sure, the graphics were a lot cleaner, but once you played one Sonic game that was a 2D side-scroller, you've played them all. It didn't really become all that better until Sonic 3D. But by the time Sonic came out on the Dreamcast, which was a pretty good game, and even though Sonic was pretty popular as a character, it just wasn't enough to keep the Sega Dreamcast afloat. And like I said earlier, if they had more endorsements from other companies such as Capcom or even Natsume, Taito, Square, it might have kept the Sega afloat. But they ran into the same problems that killed out the 3DO. It was too expensive, it was overhyped, and a lot of the games were rushed. And I mean, if you look at a lot of the bad games, a lot of them were good games on other systems, but when it came to the Sega, they just flopped. Anyway, that's my rendition of the console wars, and this is my opinions between the two systems. I hope you enjoyed it, and questions or comments are welcome. And by the way, I do like the Sega CD, but then again too, I didn't like a lot of the games that came out on it. The only one I will play over again would be Mortal Kombat. Other than that, no.